And Jan is officially now the first person who's applying. So we were talking about frameworks up to this point with philosophers and Konrad, I mean. And then now Jan is going to talk about how, I mean, we move with Jan to the application part. And I'm going to just mute ourselves now. Thank you, Jan.
All right. Thank you very much for this really interesting symposium. And I really enjoyed the stimulating talks that we just heard. My goal here is something else. I would like to entertain you with some data now, but it's not from lesion mapping, but it's rather combining evidence from two studies that we've been conducting recently in my lab, and that I would like to present to you. And I think, for me at least, they kind of shed a different light on a prediction error or expectancy violations that occur quite frequently in real life and in science. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge the two brilliant and very diligent graduate students who have the privilege to present their work today. So these are Tatja Buitze, who is also in the audience here, and Leon Möhring, and they've been really the lead investigators on these two studies, and I think they did a really excellent job in analyzing and acquiring these data. So let me start by just some general remarks. So expectancy violations are really sort of a mismatch between our internal model of the world and the external reality. And this happens quite frequently, and it usually triggers an update of this internal model. And the computational equivalent of this is the prediction error, as most of you know. And that really scales with the size of the expectancy violation. And in computational theory, this usually acts as a teaching signal to update future expectations and to make better predictions. And when we talk about reward expectation, there's a long tradition of neuroscientific work that has culminated in what's now known as the dopamine hypothesis about reward prediction errors. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but it basically states that dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area encode a signal that's similar or that resembles a reward prediction error. And this is then just broadcast to multiple brain regions, including the ventral striatum, where it's picked up usually in human fMRI. So, but the traditional view of prediction errors is that it's really a mismatch signal that is reduced in the course of updating predictions in the future to make better decisions. And hang on, let me see. And about 10 or 15 years ago, the distinction between model-based and model-free learning became a really hot topic in decision neuroscience, and its implementation as two different variants of reinforcement learning theory revealed that this gives rise to two different prediction error signals. A state prediction error signal that basically models the mismatch between the state that you got to and the state that you were expecting to get to, and a reward prediction error that just basically signals the difference between what you really got and what kind of reward you were expecting. And in our, like now already 12 years ago, we could show in a study that these two different error signals correlated with both activity in distinct brain regions. So in the case of the state prediction error, or SPE, it was the IPS and the DLPFC. Whereas for reward prediction errors, we could find something correlate in the ventral striatum. And this finding has been replicated many times now with the same task or a slightly different variance. And further investigations show that efficient learning really combines these two learning strategies or it arbitrates between these two learning strategies. So let me briefly now show you, or let me tell you about sort of the reasoning that kind of got us to the study that I'm going to present to you now. So about 10 or 15 years of studying multivariate patterns of neural activity in the brain led us to conclude that external stimuli and as well as internal states are represented, or maybe I should rather say can be discriminated from each other, because representation is such a complicated term, but can be discriminated from each other based on these neural patterns of neural activity, and that these neural activities are also reconfigured during learning. And since the size of the prediction error is really commensurate to the change in expectations, and it should also scale with the amount of change in neural activation patterns. So this is one of our hypotheses that we set out to investigate, and behavioral adaptation is the ultimate goal of learning. So the change in pattern activation should also scale up with a change in behavioral policy. And ideally, since we are talking about different prediction errors, a state and a reward prediction error, we would like to see these changes in pattern activation specific for each error. And the way we address this now is by developing sort of a modified two-step Markov decision task. And you can see here in this slide over here is sort of the structure of this task. So you always start out in one state and you have a decision to make. The first decision is state decision. So you have to decide whether you want to go to the red state or the blue state by choosing one of two buttons here. And then you get to these states, and then you have to make a second decision about some symbols that you see on the screen, and these symbols are associated with high and low reward. And you learn that over time. It's not a very complicated task, but it nicely separates sort of state from reward decisions. And in order to induce prediction errors that can be really separated in the brain, we actually came up with a few manipulations. So in each run, there were 5 runs in the experiments, we had a reward and a state reversal. So basically these two states exchange here, and these two states exchange at different points during the run. And this induces, of course, a high state or reward prediction error. And because the amount of reward is roughly the same on both of these arms here, you can exchange the state and get a large state prediction error without actually not getting a large reward prediction error, and vice versa. So when you exchange these two guys over here, you don't get a really huge state prediction error, but rather only reward prediction error. And we also introduced some catch trials to trigger some unexpected reward and state transitions and outcomes, further introducing more errors in the design. And we also had free and forced choices, so that subjects would not only choose the good option, but also choose to experience the unfortunate outcomes, so that we had a good sampling of all different states. And computationally, we applied the model that we used in that first paper, and that we developed in this first paper, which we then back then termed sort of a hybrid learner. And this, I don't want to go through all the formalisms here, but basically just highlight that the reward prediction error in that model-free SARSA learner is just a regular temporal difference error, and the forward learner basically computes a state prediction error just as a surprise signal between the expectation of a transition and what you actually get. And then these two, and importantly, this model-based forward learner only learns the state transition matrix. It doesn't learn about the reward expectations. These enter at a later point in the model. And then in this hybrid learner, it's just simply a weighted combination of these two model-free and model-based learners with a constant weight. And then we use softmax action selection on this net Q value. And down here below, you can see very nicely that our task, when you model it computationally, gives rise to really orthogonal RPEs and SPEs. So whenever sort of the RPE is very small here, you get a large SPE, and vice versa. So the first thing that we wanted to look at is, can we replicate the findings that we found back then, as many other people did, and so did we. So we used sort of model-informed univariate prediction error analyses, univariate analyses of these prediction errors, and simply looked for correlations of the magnitude of the bold response with these different prediction error signals. And we also found sort of correlates of the SPE and the IPS over here, and in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and a signal of reward prediction errors in the ventral striatum over here. So this was really nice, but not very surprising. And then we computed the intersection of these findings with our previous findings and used those regions in the IPS and in the ventral striatum as the seed voxels for all future analysis that I'm going to talk to you about. So the first thing that we did was really, if we want to investigate how prediction errors trigger or predict pattern changes in the brain, we need to calculate or we need to define an index that represents this change. And the way we went about this is, I'm going to show it to you here now. So this is some trial T, and we have sort of the state decision queue over here. We measure a pattern of neural activity over here. Then the person makes a decision, sees the outcome. This gives rise to a state prediction error. Then there's the reward decision that's not shown over here. And on the next trial, you see the same queue again, and you measure a different pattern of neural activity. And we calculate the difference between these two different patterns as the Fisher Z-transformed correlation distance, which is sort of a standard measure in RSA analyses, one of them at least. And then we quantify sort of that change in pattern as a single value, basically. And we do this in a searchlight analysis where we basically sweep all across the brain. We take the patterns within that sphere that we defined with 10 millimeter radius, and we replace that pattern change index from one trial to the next in the center voxel of that square, and then basically sweeping all around. So what we get here is a trial by trial index or trial by trial images of changes in neural patterns. And in the course of doing that, we've basically reduced a multivariate brain signal into a univariate signal of change, which we then simply can relate in simple GLMs with other univariate signals. So I think this is, I haven't seen this before, and I think it's quite an interesting way to combine univariate and multivariate analysis that should be applicable to many different questions as well. So now that we have this signal of pattern change trial by trial, we can now look where does this pattern change occur in response to the signals in the IPS and in the ventral striatum, where we found representations of reward and state prediction errors. So we extracted the trial by trial bold response in these seed regions and then simply correlated them in a GLM type analysis with these pattern change images, and we were able to show that here the bold signal in the ventral striatum predicted pattern changes in all these areas that are shown here in red. And these were mostly in the DLPFC, in the OFC, and in the anterior cingulate cortex. Whereas when you start the analysis here from the bold signal in the IPS, which codes for the state prediction errors, we find a set of other brain areas that showed significant pattern change, and these were mostly located in the precuneus, in the supplementary motor area, superior parietal lobe, and in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So what we have here is now two distinct error signals in two different brain regions that predict pattern changes in also distinct other brain regions in the brain. So how do these pattern changes look like? And in order to visualize that, just to give you an impression, we focused in on these points during each run where the reward and the state association switch. So those are the points in the run where there's the largest reward and state prediction errors. And what you can see here very nicely in this region that was explained from this reward prediction error signal in the ventral striatum, you can see this really stark increase in pattern change around the time of the reward reversal, and it actually prolongs onto the next trial, and then it kind of goes back down again. And this all happens at the reward decision, but when you look at the state decision, which comes before this, you don't see this kind of pattern change. So there's a clear specificity of this effect in the OFC with regard to reward reward prediction errors. And you can see the converse, the opposite of that, in the in the precuneus over here. You can see an increase in this pattern change index at the state decision, which is this blue curve over here, while at the same time during the later reward decision, the pattern change actually goes down. So this is quite nice that it's so specific for each error type and the associated pattern changes. Now, one could now ask the question, okay, we have these regions now that show pattern changes. What do these areas represent? And theoretically, one would expect that when you have prediction error that are represented in certain brain areas and that causes pattern changes, these should be kind of related to the expectation signal that are updated with these reward prediction errors. So what we did in order to do that, to test this idea, is we ran another model-informed univariate GLM and looked for correlates of the value of the chosen option. So this is this reward expectation signal. And we found correlates of that here in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the subgenual ACC and also here medial frontal cortex. So this is quite expected, and this has been shown in many different studies. So we basically found that same signal over here. And we also did a multivariate decoding analysis where we looked for these multivariate representations of these state expectations and found a really strong effect here in the precuneus. And if you look for statistically valid conjunctions between these pattern change areas shown in blue over here and this green area showing reward expectations on the one hand, and also between these red areas, which are these pattern change areas, and the yellow ones, which are these value of the chosen option areas, you actually find a statistically significant overlap over here in the precuneus and then the VMPFC. So while I'm not saying that all of these state expectation representations are explained by these pattern changes, there at least is some association and some suggestion that these pattern changes are also involved in updating these state expectations. Now, the ultimate goal of learning is to really adapt the behavior according to the updated predictions. And we wanted to show this as well. And in order to do that, we had to calculate a change in an index for the change in behavioral policy. So a delta policy term for either the state or the reward decision. And because the choices are binary, we actually opted to use a more continuous signal, meaning that the model calculated action probabilities here, which this is sort of the probability of choosing one particular action in the first state. So this is the state decision here. And then you subtract from that the same action in the same state on the next trial, regardless of whether this was chosen or not. So this calculates a delta policy term that you can then use to see if that's associated with these pattern changes. And what we saw here is we have the ventrostratum over here, which is that area that represents these reward prediction errors, and we have the OFC, which is associated with the ventrostratum in terms of pattern changes. And then if you separate these pattern change areas into areas of trials of really high pattern change and trials of really low pattern changes, then you can see that this corresponds to very high values in delta policy when the pattern change was really high, and this was significantly larger than those low values in delta policy when these trials when the pattern change was really small. And you can see also over here, this is back again looking at the mean bold response in the ventrostratum, which was sort of the origin of all of this. And you can also see here that for very high trials with very high pattern changes, we had a really high bold activity in the stratum, and this was higher than doing these low pattern change trials, which is actually expected because that's what we've shown before. And we see the same thing happening in other areas in the brain that are related to the state prediction error. So we have this state prediction error signal, the pattern changes in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and it's the same mechanism here again. So we separated them into trials of very high and very low pattern changes, and these were associated with high values in delta policy for the state decision and low values for the behavioral change. And we also saw the same relationship here in the IPS. So to conclude this study, this first study, we were able to show that prediction error-induced bold responses in RPE and SPE coding regions, so in the ventral striatum and IPS, predict the pattern changes in distinct error-related networks. And some of these nodes in these networks, like the precuneus and VMPFC, are related to encoding state and reward expectations, respectively, while other nodes of these networks, namely VMPFC and OFC, again, predict changes in behavioral policies for these state and reward related decisions. So what we are able to show here is that we have two dissociable and parallel brain networks that really implement this chain of prediction error, pattern change, and behavioral change. So I think that's quite nice and shows that we really represent these two different error signals and the associated changes in reconfiguring expectations in distinct brain networks. However, to give you a sort of a broader picture, this prediction error here really acts as a teaching signal that drives neural pattern changes and updates expectation in behavioral policy. So what I'm trying to do in this next study now is to offer you another perspective on prediction errors, where prediction error are usually used as a deliberate signal to communicate between two different agents. So when you talk about communication is really successful when the sender is able to direct the receiver's attention to relevant parts of the message. And when we use language, we use prosody and mimicry and also gestures like I'm doing right now to emphasize certain parts of the speech. And such emphasis creates deviance that capture your attention now. So I'm capturing your attention. I want to direct it to some relevant parts that I wanted to say. And more generally, such oddballs or deviants, or however you want to call them, these are violations of expectancies and that can be used as a communicative tool. So it's not just a mismatch signal, it's really deployed deliberately here. And we investigate these violations in the context of a cooperative communication game in which the sender and the receiver have to develop a new quote-unquote language to communicate with each other successfully. So here's what this game looks like. It's called the Tacit Communication Game. It has been around for a little while. It's a cooperative communication game with two players. So both players have to start from a starting position, and they have to reach their respective goal position. So this is the sender over here on the left side, and he eventually has to end up here by moving his game token over here. And this is the receiver side. So the receiver sees the starting position, but he doesn't know where his own goal position is. And the sender then has to communicate through his movement pattern where the receiver's goal position is so he can move effectively to that. And each trial in this game has a different goal configuration, and the sender is endowed with 10 points, and each step that he takes costs 1 point. So if the receiver then moves to the correct goal position, the trial is successful and both players receive the remaining points left over from these 10 points. So this provides an urge to communicate successfully or effectively, but also briefly. So you want to, like, it prioritizes shorter messages over longer messages. And I want to give you an example so that you know what I'm talking about, and put yourself into the receiver's position now. And I'm going to play you a few messages, and you can ask yourself, where is the goal position that the sender who is moving his token now is trying to communicate to you. So this is not working. I have to, I guess, switch off the pointer here. Interruption. Let's see. automatic. Maybe it's this one. Well, sorry about this. I have to switch this off. So this was one message that the sender could send. I'm going to play it again. Ask yourself, where is the goal position if you see this message now? Okay, now I'm going to play you another message. It's this one over here. So play it again. So where's the goal position now? And here's the third message that the sender could send. This goes like this. Again, you can see it again. It's right over here. So ask yourself, which message was better in conveying the goal position to you? And the goal position, of course, was this this tile over here. So it's immediately here, straight down. So this was the goal position. Was it this direct path message over here? Was it this sort of message where you enter and exit the goal position, or was it this where you wiggle down here? Okay, so this gives you an impression of what the task looks like. And this goes on for many different goal configurations over 100 trials. So people kind of play with each other and they establish a code between them. And some are really successful and some are not so successful. And then it leads also to frustration, as always when communication fails. Okay, so here's again a little picture of how this task progresses. So in the beginning, the sender sees his goal position and his own goal position. He creates a message that is not shown to the participants. Then it's played back to both of them at exactly the same speed. So the sender can't really use speed or make a pause at the position, so that we prevent that, because otherwise the task gets really, really easy. And then finally, after both have seen the message again, the sender has to move to what he thinks his goal position is. And if that's correct, then the trial is successful. So what we observed in most of the subject's data is we saw these three different message types that I just showed to you. So we have this, what we termed enter-exit message. So you basically enter the receiver goal, exit again, and then move along. You have this wiggle message where you wiggle between the two different adjacent states of the receiver goal and the next one, or you have these message where you simply pass by. And this is the frequency of message types that were selected by our participants. So most of them came up with this enter-exit strategy. Then this wiggling was also the next frequent message type, and the least frequent message type was this pass-by message. And when you separate, when you actually describe the task in a little bit more detail, you can think of the easy trials. Sorry, this is actually, this should be hard trials. This is mislabeled. So the hard trials are those trials where the receiver goal lies directly on the path of the sender to his own goal. So this is very difficult to identify. Whereas on easy trials, the receiver goal lies somewhere outside of the direct path, and it's therefore just easy to get this enter-exit message, because you just simply have to move one over and then move back, and then you move, and it's a very clear communicative signal. Again, if you look at the frequencies here, it's still that for easy and hard trials, the enter-exit message is the most frequent one, but more so for the easy trials, whereas the wiggle message and the pass-by message are more frequently used for these hard trials, when the receiver goal is here on the direct path over here. So computational modeling. So there's only one computational model has been developed. It's purely based on simulations. There's no actual empirical data validating this model. And this model basically defines belief representations for the receiver goal of the entire state space, so to speak. And these belief representations are updated based on the success and failure of each trial. And it selects among all possible messages the one that has the highest probability for the receiver goal. There's some theory of mind mechanism built into this, in the sense that you take the perspective of the other player and then use that and also to guide your decision of what message do you want to select. But all in all, this places a huge memory demand, that you have to represent all messages for all different goal configurations, basically. And the model only selects entire messages, it does not model individual step. And when you simulate this, the learning is very slow, and you basically mostly get pass-by messages, and these to a lesser degree enter exomes. So it doesn't, and this is regardless of the theory of mind level. So basically, this model is not very good in fitting empirical data. So what we set out to do is develop a completely new model for this task. Let me see. And we started from a very different perspective on this. So we wanted a model with simpler cognitive process without these extensive memory demands. And that called for a model where the receiver could detect his goal position from the movement pattern and not from the goal-specific belief distributions over state. And we wanted a step-by-step model because in the end, we want to correlate that with biophysical signals. And the basic idea, coming back to this idea of a prediction error or an expectancy violation. So we can define, or we can exploit strong priors on the sender's action and use the deviation from these priors, like the information theoretic surprise for action selection, to communicate relevant information. And let me tell you how this is implemented. I'm going to explain this more visually over here. So what we have on the one end, we have what we call sort of an action prior. And this is an idea, comes from very basic physics in the sense that an object that moves and without any external or internal forces just tends to continue its movement along the same trajectory. So when you move your token from here to here, the expectation is that you basically continue this movement. So this should have the highest probability over here. And anything that deviates from this continuation movement has a lower probability. So this is actually more, if you talk about surprise now, this is more surprising than continuing. And turning around and going backwards is even more surprising. So, and it's important to note that this action prior is dynamic in the sense that it resets with every step on that message. So it's a dynamic thing that kind of rotates around. And the other thing that we defined is what we call sort of a state prior. This gives you a general sense of direction, and it is invariant to the movements. So it basically is just simply a decreasing probability from the sender's goal. And of course, this decrease is parameterized in the model as well as these probabilities are. I'm leaving out the details here, but basically it gives you a general sense of direction where the sender needs to go. So you can combine these priors, so to calculate sort of a prior for the entire action, giving a state by multiplying this action prior, so the prior for a particular action given that set of action priors and the probability of going to the next state, giving these state priors over here. And then that's the important point here. We calculate the surprise from this term over here. So this is actually how unexpected that move would be with respect to these priors. And we combine that now with a discounted reward signal, which is basically sort of, it's the length of the sender's goal, to length of the sender's goal. That's kind of the reward signal that puts the urgency into this game. And we then calculate an expected reward signal, which we use then again for in softmax action selection to calculate the probability of each particular action that is available. And when you do this, you realize, and you let this run, and you realize actually that there are two different planning phases in this task. So the first planning phase goes until the sender reaches the receiver's goal, which in this case is over here. And for this first part of the message, you would use this whole model that I just explained. But the goal kind of changes once you are at the receiver's goal. So you want to use surprising moves to communicate to the receiver where his goal is. But once you've done that, you just hurry up and go to your own goal and not waste any more movements, because that basically costs more points, right? So, and when you implement these two different planning strategies in this model, we can then compare this with the behavioral data. And here on the left side, you can see that the frequency that the model generates by using the mechanism that I just explained, the surprise selection until the receivers go, we can basically generate almost the exact frequency that our subjects did. And when we look at sort of the separation into hard and easy trials, you can basically see that the pattern is kind of there. Like you have more enter-exit message for easy than hard trials, which kind of corresponds here. You have more hard trials, and the wiggly message is used more in hard trials than in easy trials, and it doesn't really conform here with the pass-by message. But also that is the least frequently used message. So I'm not surprised that it doesn't really fit all that well over there. So overall, I would say that this already represents a very nice and a different approach to this new communication task where you're trying to convey meaning by using surprising moves. Let me see how much time I have left. Should probably leave this out. So this is just some preliminary data where we analyzed PDR responses on each step. I'm going to skip that over here. We basically see an effect in the first half of the PDR, where the PDR correlates with the surprise, but not with the expected value. But this is just very preliminary data. We need to find an analysis that shows this much more clearly. Anyway, I want to summarize now and with the study and saying that different message types in the different communication games, that we found these different message types here, and these diverging steps induce an expectancy violation to emphasize relevant information. We developed a new computational model that uses these expectancy violations, these information theoretic surprises, to select steps in a message to communicate the receiver's goal position. This model included dynamic action priors and static state priors, showed pretty good fit with the empirical data message frequencies so far, and we are working on showing that the match is also there when we characterize these goal configurations in a different way. And we have preliminary evidence that the early PDR correlates with surprise, but not with expected value, which is really encouraging, because what we know from the PDR and its generation in the brain by the locus ceruleus, and that also tracks sort of uncertainty and change points in the environment. So that fits very nicely with the ideas that are conveyed in this model. And in closing, and maybe in starting sort of a discussion, what these two studies have shown to me, that in one study we sort of used prediction errors in the traditional sense, that are a teaching signal that updates expectation and modulates behavioral change. But these prediction errors occur as a result of a mismatch between expectations and the reality, but it's kind of passive in a way. So it's unintentional. So these prediction errors are just, they need to be reduced in order to make better predictions and make better decisions in the end. So, but it's not that they are used intentionally. And this contrasts with sort of this informational view, quote unquote, from the second study, where prediction errors or surprises in that sense are generated intentionally by a sender to convey relevant information and guide behavior in another agent. So you have an intentional violations of prior expectations. And these views do not necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. I realize that. So so you can think of, when we are in an experimental context, you can think of let's say we do reversal learning studies, and the experimenter changes the reward probabilities at a certain points of the experiment. That is like me as an experimenter communicating to the participant, now you have to pay attention. Now you have to learn something new. It's like I'm using, my design is inducing prediction errors almost intentionally to investigate learning. But if you think how prediction errors usually occur in real life, like the classic example is that my favorite restaurant is hiring a new cook, and all of a sudden the food is not tasty to me anymore. For me, that prediction error that changes my behavior, and I don't visit that restaurant anymore, that prediction error is kind of passive, right? It's not that the cook is trying to communicate to me something with that prediction error. It's just kind of occurs for me, from my perspective in the environment. So it's sort of this error signal that just drives updating of expectations and changes behavior. Whereas in this other view, in this informational view, we really have sort of this intentional use of prediction errors. And it would, in my opinion, be really interesting to contrast these two different views, so to speak, directly, and see if there's also different different associative brain regions involved in this. But this is just speculative. So in the end, I would like to thank again the two people who've done all this wonderful work. So Tatja and Leon, who've been the sort of lead investigators on this, of course, the other people in my lab, funding agencies, and thank you very much. I look forward to your questions now.